Oh. Okay, so our presenters for today are Dan Kelly, who is a professor of accounting here at ICC, and Jennifer Costa, who is professor of art at ICC. And we have some questions for them, so we'll go ahead and get started with this. So first question, what was your teaching life like in February of 2020?
Oh, me.
Jennifer's gotta go first.
Well, I've been teaching here for a while, so I had it down. Like, I knew what I was doing, I knew what the students were doing. We were right on track with all the projects that we were working with in 3D design and in Sculpture 1. And it was just like any other spring semester in February.
I would agree. I had a couple I had one or two online classes that semester, I don't remember, and a number of in-person classes. And for the first 7 weeks, 8 weeks, it was pretty much business as usual, as it relates to being a spring semester.
Okay, so how did things change when we switched to totally remote work? The $24,000 question.
It wasn't fun. So my class is a studio-based class, so students meet twice a week for 2 hours and 50 minutes. So it's very hands-on. It's in a lab, but there's a lot of tools. We do a lot of projects that can really only be done in the lab. And then all of a sudden, we weren't there. So it was very different. And it was a huge challenge to figure out how I was going to get the students to still earn their 3D design and Sculpture 1 credit by doing projects that they had to do at home that were totally different than the ones that I've been doing for the past 20 years.
So sometimes things work out in your favor, and the year before COVID hit, or maybe the year and a half or so before COVID hit, I had taken 2 primary classes that I teach and converted them into hybrids, because our evening courses used to run until 9:30 at night, and I found that nobody wants to stay until 9:30 to talk about accounting. So I converted them to hybrids, shortened the time up, and I built a bunch of videos to supplement some of the material that might be missed. That was really fortuitous, because when we got to COVID, I was able to use those videos. The challenge that I ran into was more of my personal life. My wife's a high school teacher. My oldest daughter at the time was in kindergarten. I had a son in preschool, and I had a 6-month-old. So we were running a daycare, a preschool, a kindergarten, a high school, and a community college out of our house all at the same time. So that created some challenges that, I met with my students on Zoom, but I usually did that with a baby on my lap, or my daughter was working on her kindergarten stuff with her class, and I'm sitting there right next to her, having office hours with some of my students. So just that kind of stuff. But you just figure things out, right? You just, rather than sit there and go, how the heck are we going to do this? You just do it and figure out how you do it later.
I was going to say, I could interject here a little bit. For us in the library, we were kind of fortuitous in the fact that the month before we held our staff meeting via Teams, before we went down. So we had just heard that Teams was getting started, and there was starting to be little rumors about that we might close down type of thing. And so my boss said, let's try Teams and see how it works. And so when we actually did go remote, suddenly we were like ahead of the curve in that respect. So that was really very helpful for us too. So I can see where the fortuitous planning helps a lot. So, what was one particular challenge you had at that point? I mean, Jen, you've already alluded to it a little bit, but do you want to elaborate on that a little more?
I was lucky in the sense that I was already teaching art appreciation online and had been for like 10 years. So the whole going digital for me, that wasn't the challenge. That was the okay part. That was the been there, done that. That's not a big deal. The challenge was okay, rather than showing my students how to cast a block of plaster and be a little Michelangelo and carve a realistic shoe out of a block of plaster with mallets and chisels, or how to do brazing, you know, fire, welding, that kind of stuff. It's like, what projects can I have them do with everyday materials at home that they don't have to go anywhere and get anything? Because the whole like, no, we're not gonna go to the store to buy any supplies. And I even had a handful of students whose parents weren't allowing them to purchase anything from Amazon. They didn't want anything coming through the mail. So it was okay, but let's go back to the very basics of 3D design. And so rather than carve a shoe out of plaster, we're going to construct one out of a cardboard. And then, oh, well, you know, light is always three-dimensional. We don't ever talk about it. We don't ever use it because that's further on in education for sculpture. And guess what? We're finding light. So let's cut out patterns and designs and have them outside in the sun, that kind of thing. And even then, that wasn't necessarily the biggest challenge. The biggest challenge was I can give a demo of how to do something in about half an hour to an hour, depending upon what it is. It would take me 2 solid days of coming up with a new assignment, doing the new assignment myself, so that way there was an example, doing a lecture, so putting the lecture together, which I would normally just be able to talk about in class, like, oh, pull up some images, here's this artist. And then writing out the assignment, doing a video on how to do the assignment, and getting all that. Like, I worked harder during COVID, getting content online for a very hands-on class than I did when I first started teaching here. And so the challenge was, how am I gonna get any sleep? How am I gonna get this done? How am I gonna get it to where the students will understand what I'm talking about and be able to do these projects without having to leave their house, without having to order any materials, and with just using what they've already got at home? How am I gonna get them to do 3D? Like drawing, you get a piece of paper and a pencil and you can draw. But 3D is like you're constructing something. And how do I do it in such a way that doesn't look like it's elementary school? That it's gonna be something that when they transfer, they still get, you know, those learning objectives from that class that transfer. That was the challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I teach in a different discipline, obviously, and there's not as much physical nature to the material. I think one of the challenges I faced was having created the hybrid courses in the past. I had the experience of creating the videos, et cetera. And so now a lot of my colleagues are going, oh, hey, you know how to do this. So how do I do this? And to your point about trying to teach someone who's not in front of you, that's a challenge. And then my students as well. I mean, most of them adapted well enough to Zoom. Zoom is a pretty easy technology to get comfortable with. But, you know, just learning how to communicate better virtually, then, you know, you're not going to see me in class, so you can't just stop at my desk after class. We have to, you know, email, we have to talk on Zoom, et cetera. So just helping others and myself to get adapted to a different form of communication and how we do those things. Probably the biggest challenge.
I want to follow up a question with you, Jennifer. How did you go about grading things like that?
It was more along the lines of, did you do the work? Did you understand the concept? And
Okay.
then, you know, zooming in with the students and talking with them.
Was it a one-on-one type thing?
I tried.
Okay.
I really tried. It was hard with some of them that they just couldn't do it and they didn't want to do it. And then some were like, hey, how's it going? You know, and then it was no problem with that. And I found it was just easier just to email each student and just make comments on their work. It was easier for, at least for my particular student. Because, you know, every class has its own like feel and own read every semester. And that's how they work.
Yeah.
In fact, I've got actually in my Sculpture 1 class now, one of my students who was a COVID year student, a COVID semester student, that I was like, wait, I don't know your name. So I didn't I learned their names really well. And then it's been such a long time because I stopped seeing them in person. But now they're back and they're like, yeah, that was an interesting semester.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I'm like, oh, yay, that's so fun.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. Okay, so what was one particular success that you had during remote teaching?
I had to rethink some of the projects that I was giving. Some of the projects, I wound up, like I said, doing more of putting together the lecture about the artist. So I do a lot of projects that are based on specific artists. Like when they carve their plaster shoe, I call them my little Michelangelos. Carve everything away that's not supposed to be there, type thing. And oh, we've got this project, we're gonna base it off of David Smith. We've got this project, we're gonna base it off of Louise Nevelson. So putting together those lecture videos, I still use them now, and I tell them, just watch the video on Canvas now. So that way I don't have to take up as much time during class, and then they get more work time. So the project that I had to come up with, like I replaced one project with a project that I came up with during COVID, and I think it's a successful project now, more so than a previous project that I had been getting. So that idea of forcing myself to rethink and be like, okay, some projects will work for 20, 30 years and without any problem, and others like don't. And so being forced to rethink some of those projects made me create like different and better projects.
Dan?
Well, we went to in the fall of 2021, or 2020, excuse me, we went to live online courses, right? What we now call online scheduled courses. And so I had to think, okay, how am I gonna demonstrate what we're doing in accounting rather than just talking it out? I gotta be able to demonstrate it. So my first semester, I used a Wacom tablet, which is about this big, to write, and then students would be able to see that. Or I used a document camera as well, where I just had an actual notebook, you know, pen and paper, and there was a camera above me. But eventually we got to the point where we started using an iPad, and we started sharing it in Zoom. Megan Bomer and I started developing some technology solutions, including the camera that we're using here today. We didn't develop the cameras, but we're, you know, just how can we use these tools? And as a result, now when I teach in-person classes, I still use my iPad, and I project that in Zoom onto the screen in the classroom, so that my students have access to the notes outside of class. They know exactly what was written. There's a recording of class at all times. So, you know, that kind of stuff. Megan and I were kind of having those conversations before COVID, like, wouldn't it be great if we could do this? But COVID kind of kicked that into gear, like, okay, now let's try it and see how it goes. So over the 2020, 2021 academic year, we kind of developed it, we test piloted it out this previous academic year, and now we're using it on a pretty regular basis. There's probably about 15 of us who use iPads and owls in our classrooms, and our students tend to like it.
That sounds
Really
really,
jump started you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Doing what you wanted.
Absolutely, yes.
yeah, I think a lot of instances, COVID just kind of gave us the nudge that we needed.
Yeah.
Not exactly a nudge, but more of a kick.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Yeah, no, just putting it in.
Yeah, exactly.
I've got demos for projects now, but I'm like, watch the demo, the Canvas. For that way when students miss, because they missed out on a 45-minute demo on how to glue foam together and carve it. And so when you missed it, okay, I'll show you quickly, but watch the video,
Yeah.
because that's way more in depth and detailed before you come to class type thing.
Yeah, who knew that a flipped classroom would work for an art class?
I know, right?
Yeah, but you know, flipped classrooms have been bandied about for years, but now suddenly it's like, okay, now, and it works.
Yeah.
It works a lot well, so. Is there a student success story during this time frame that you'd like to mention?
Honestly, it's a blur. I can't. I mean, I just think in general, if the students made it through the class, they were all successful. Because especially the fall semester, it was, so spring, when we shut down, like we were totally shut down, but then fall semester, when we came back, like you were still totally at home, but I was back.
Right.
So instead of my students meeting twice a week for 2 hours and 50 minutes, the class was split in half, and half of them came in on Mondays and the other half came in on Wednesdays. And so there was that challenge of the cohesion between the students, because you guys are still all in a big class together. So I would make the Wednesday students Zoom in on Monday at the beginning of class. They didn't have to stay there the whole time, but just to check in, and then vice versa type thing. And I think that making them understand that they were still part of the class both days of the week, and that everybody still completed the class. And we were able to go back to some of the more traditional projects that I'd been given, but then there were other things that I had to do to, you know, compensate for students not being there or having to quarantine or something like that. And I think that just that they still produced work during that time was successful.
Yeah, I mean, any student that persevered through that is a success story, certainly. But I went this summer, let's see, summer of 21, I went to a golf outing. And a girl was working the golf outing, walked up to me and said, "Professor Kelly." And I kind of looked at her like, "I know you, but I don't know you." She was in my online schedule class, but all I ever saw was her in a box, right? So to meet her in person was different. And she said, "Yeah, I was in your class." I was, "Oh, fantastic." And she said, "I met some of my best ICC friends in that class because I would put them in breakout rooms in Zoom and go around and help them with problems and stuff. And it just so happened I paired her with the right people, and then they created friendships over Zoom, and that actually turned into real friendships. So, which I was always concerned about, because part of the reason you do group work in your class is to get your students talking to each other, to get them engaging with one another. And that's just different when it's in Zoom, right? Because you can hide behind the camera, you can be on mute and all that kind of stuff. You can't do that in person. So find that some of them were actually engaging and, you know, developing friendships and stuff was exciting.
Let me ask you guys a question, maybe more you, Dan, more than Jen, but did you, when you had classes, did you require them to turn on their cameras and things like that?
So, yeah, that was certainly a new classroom management challenge, right? Because you didn't want people to feel uncomfortable about showing their environment, where they were, you know, because some people, all they could do was be in their bedrooms, and you don't want to invade their personal space. So early on, I said, "You can turn the cameras on, you can turn them off, I don't care." Well, all I got was a bunch of dark screens. And so eventually I said, "Okay, let's turn them on. I think it's better for everybody." And nobody argued. Everybody was just like, "Yeah, you're right. Let's try it." And the classes went better when the cameras were on, for sure.
Yeah, when I had my students log in on their days that they didn't come to class, I didn't require them to turn on their cameras for the exact same reason. You know,
Right.
it's a 9 a.m. class. I guarantee that some of them were just like on
5
the
minutes
phone
up, yeah.
in bed, like, okay, and going back to sleep. But I did find that the ones that turned on their cameras were engaged a little bit more in the morning conversation than the ones that weren't. Like, "Oh, you got any questions?" "Yeah, I'm good." You know, whereas the ones that had their cameras on were the ones that.
Right.
were-
And you can
were-
see it in their faces
Yeah,
too. It's the same way you can in class. They're like, "Wait, what are we doing?"
Right.
So,
I'm gonna interject another question here, because I want Dan to talk a little bit about that project that you did that connected the faculty together during this pandemic, that maybe some of our attendees, especially the students, may not know about. So I'd like for you to talk about that a little bit.
yeah, so in the late fall 21, or late fall 20 semester, excuse me, we got word that we weren't going back in the spring in person, which we pretty well knew was gonna be the case. You know, you're heading into winter, things are just not great. I mean, just, and that wasn't anything at ICC, it just in life, just things were not great, right? I mean, it was just nothing to be looking forward to. There was no vaccine. We still are wearing masks everywhere, just, so I kind of got thinking about it a little bit, and I thought, okay, there's gotta be a way that we can, at least as a college, employees of the college, still have some camaraderie and, you know, connect with one another. So came up with an idea, and I called Megan Bomer, who's a good friend of mine here at ICC, and I said, "Just show up at Zoom 1 o'clock tomorrow. Don't ask any questions." And Megan, I knew she wouldn't. She said, "Okay." So she just showed up, and I said, "Okay, Megan, you're the first guest on what I'm calling my new podcast," which was for ICC employees. And it was just a get to know you. Where'd you grow up? How'd you land at ICC? You know, what are some of your favorite memories of ICC, people you've worked with, et cetera. And maybe it was a stroke of genius or luck or whatever, but right before I started talking to Megan, I thought, I'm just gonna tell Megan to pick the next guest. It would just be more fun if we just play this game of like tag, you know? And so I said, "Oh, okay, Megan, who should be the next person I talk to?" And she suggested Bruce Buddy, who's the vice president of finance. And the next thing you know, I'm ping ponging all across the college, talking to people, half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour, depending on who likes to talk, and just getting to know them. And truth be told, I didn't know Jennifer Before that, our paths had never really crossed, right? You're down in the basement.
Yep, right.
And I'm on the third floor.
Poor person.
Right, or Dixon or wherever, and so somebody said, well, Jennifer Costa would be an excellent guest, so I emailed Jennifer, said, I'm Dan Kelly, you probably don't know who I am, but this is what I'm doing, and I know more about Jennifer, you know, in that hour that we spent on Zoom, and this is the first time we've ever met in person,
Right.
you know, so, but I've known her for a couple of years now because of,
Yeah.
because of that, I mean, I ended up doing 25 episodes, I think it was.
Yeah.
And, you know, it was just a fun project, especially the ones that happened in like December and January, got a lot of views because people were just like, I got nothing better to do. And I heard from people that had retired from ICC going, oh, so great. Somebody sent me these. Margaret Swanson, who used to be our vice president of academic affairs. I happened to send her, she loved it, like just watched all of them. So it's just a good way to get to know our colleagues and to connect in a time where it was really difficult to connect. And so now when I see people that I've either had on the episodes or watched them, there's a little bit of connection that might not have existed without it. So it was just a fun project that I did.
Yeah.
It's like having coffee with somebody,
Yeah.
but yet,
Yeah.
like, being able to like, oh, there's Bruce Buddy, okay, I know more about him now, even though I've never actually sat down
Right.
and chatted with him at all, but being able to listen
Yeah.
to
And-
everything,
right.
it was fun.
And before we started talking, Jennifer said, you're going to North Carolina, which is where you're from. I knew that because I asked her, where are you from? Right? I mean, we talked about those kind of things. And so it was really just a fun way to meet a lot of people. I mean, I had 25 guests. I probably had met 18 of them.
Yeah.
Right? So I met some new people along the way and just get to know them better. And you hear stories like, I didn't know that. You know, I didn't know that about you. And you hear especially some of the interesting things that people do for hobbies or, you know, some of their favorite movies and things like that. We just kind of talked about everything. It was fun.
Yeah, it was very enjoyable to watch those too, as someone who would watch them. And it was like, as you said, we learned so much about our colleagues around it. I was kind of hoping to keep going with it, but I'm sure it probably.
Well,
picked up a
we
lot.
ran into the spring semester kind of wrapped up and, you know, as I said, I've got a bunch of kids, so you know, finding that window of time where I can sit down and talk, so it became a little more challenging.
Yeah, so, okay, how well has the transition back to in-person teaching gone now that we're mostly back in person, mostly? So, and, there's some follow-up questions with that too, maybe we'll touch on them, but go ahead.
Well, for me, the biggest challenge, because I've never fully was remote except for that very first like 3 to 8 weeks in the spring semester. The biggest challenge was that during the split semesters of the fall and the spring, nobody talked to one another in my classes. And that's like the biggest thing that I hate. It's because, like you said, it's like these students, not only are they learning in the classes, but they're making friends for life, you know? And I don't expect them to be friends with everybody, but in art, I like to tell them that you have to be able to tell your friend that their artwork is not great. And have a good conversation about it and how to fix it, and then be like, okay, let's go have coffee. Because you have to be able to critique one another and give pointers on how to make your artwork better. But during COVID, I don't know if it was the masks. I had to split the tables, like usually everybody's like 8 students around a big table and then 4 students around another table. Like I had to split them up, so there was only 6 in the classroom at a time, so 2 at a table. They were just in their own little world. And then like they barely, like I would ask them questions, I would like I would normally do, and nobody wanted to talk. But now, coming back fully, like the entire class, they still kind of had no masks, no nothing. Still that whole like, we're just in our own little world, not really wanting to talk. And so I've tried like icebreaker questions, like the first day of class, and that helped. Like last semester was absolutely wonderful. And it definitely is the class and the group of students that are together. I've got classes that still don't talk, no matter if I'm like, hey, everybody seen the movies, or you know, or like, okay, who's Xbox and who's PlayStation, like, or Switch, you know, whichever. But then some of them are just like, they can't stop talking. So it's like, just depending on, I guess, on what they went through during COVID and how isolated they were from people. It's whether or not they're like, oh my goodness, I'm back in with other people, hey, blah, 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 you know, and then they start talking, or if they're just like, I don't care.
Yeah, that first year, first, really the fall 21 semester coming back it was different. We had a policy where as instructors, we could not wear a mask if we were at least 8 feet away from the closest student. And of course, they could hear you better if you're not wearing a mask. So it made sense to kind of follow that policy. But then you felt like you were just like back against the wall teaching them and not able to come out and kind of engage with them, which is, I just walk a lot when I would teach. So that certainly took some adjusting. And then, you know, I went to a store where one of my students worked and she was not required to wear a mask. And she's like, oh, hey, Professor Kelly. And it took me a second because I'd only seen her from her eyes up. And I'd never seen this part of her face before. And it just took me a second. I thought, that's kind of a shame, right? I see this person, she was a good student there every week. So she's here twice a week for 16 weeks. And because I had never seen her face, it just didn't quite connect the way it would under normal circumstances. So, you know, that kind of stuff. And it just took some adjusting for everybody, I think. And, you know, hopefully they still got something out of the classes. But I feel like this year things are closer to normal than they have been in a long time. And to your point, you know, sometimes it's just a mix of students and that's just random. This semester I have a class where, as I like to say, all I have to do is walk in and light the match and the fire starts burning. Those classes are rare, but I'm really thankful to have one. Because it feels like the first one I've had in a long time.
Needless to say, around the college, there's been a couple of changes that have happened, so I kind of want to get your little feeling on that. The switches around with the ICC website. Did those affect you in any way, shape, or form?
I'm still learning it.
Yeah.
I'm not completely happy with the website.
Because you're recording.
But
Yeah.
I know, but it's just because it's hard to navigate at first. And once you get used to it, you're used to it. And so I'm just fearful of some of the students. So it's not bad. It's just.
Yeah, I don't think there's major implications on me or on my colleagues from that, other than you might have had some links in your syllabus that don't work anymore, or things like that. But on the flip side of that, we now have a course tool or a college tools button in Canvas that we didn't have before.
Right.
So, you know, there's certainly, I mean, I think everything that they're doing with the website by ICC is streamlining things the way they probably should be. It's just when you've been doing it for so long,
Yeah,
a different way, it takes time to adjust it.
Yeah.
So I think new students probably don't notice anything because they don't know what it was like.
And then Canvas versus Blackboard.
Right, I was gonna say, that's my next question.
Hands down, Canvas just makes it so much easier.
Yes.
And it's just, like you said, more streamlined, and it makes it so much easier to, I mean, I wish I could change the title module. I hate that. But it's like, okay, this, and this, and here's everything. Boom, it's so much easier to drag and put everything together and upload your videos. That took some getting used to, but after teaching online for, you know, at least 10 years, and you poke around long enough, you can figure it out.
Yeah, so. Is there anything else that you'd like to mention that kind of talked about the whole rethinking that we did over the past 3 years?
It was a huge challenge, but I think that we're all better for it. You know, there was a lot of good stuff that happened. You know, when we tried that, and now like filming, like I'm much more savvy now at filming demo videos and editing and doing all this. I'm like, oh, I never thought that I'd be. So not only do I have to teach the class, but now I'm also a filmmaker.
Right.
And I'm like, I never know, and a photographer. And all these other things, I'm like, I just want to raise something, you know, and I think that expanding faculty knowledge in order to help the students out more was something just absolutely amazing. I mean, there were some faculty members that had never been online ever, other than to post grades, and some of them just like, they just took off with it, and they're like, okay, this is what we're doing. So I think that mentality of we're definitely gonna get through this and come out on the better side of it. At least that's where I'm at.
Yeah, I agree. I think it forced many to upgrade their technology skills, whether they're starting at zero and just trying to get basic, or they were at basic trying to go to a little more advanced, or they were wherever you were, you had to think more along the lines of technology. I think our students are expecting that now because they've been exposed to it so much over the last couple of years. But I think the key for us is to utilize as much technology as we can but make sure it doesn't get in the way of learning and it doesn't get in the way of personal connection at the same time, right? We don't want, I mean, I could have all my students join me on Zoom every day, right, if needed. I don't want to do that. Now, I've done that a couple times in the last year when I've been sick or when my kids have been sick. That was something we couldn't have done before, but now it's like, oh yeah, we can just join on Zoom for one class period, no big deal. Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's a good use of the technology, but we don't want to do that because, oh, you know what, it's 10 degrees outside, I'm just a little too cold to go in. Like we're not doing that. So just making sure that we use the technology the right way and it doesn't get in the way of learning or connecting with our students.
Yeah, and I would add to that, as far as that goes, a lot of the meetings that we're required to go to anymore. I mean, it's nice to be able to get together in person and things
Yes.
like that. But there are days when it's like, there's no way, there's too much else going on. I
Yes.
need to hang around somewhere. I need to try, but I can attend through Zoom or Teams.
That I do love.
Yes, absolutely, especially.
Would I prefer in person? Yes.
Sure.
But
But in person for me means juggling babysitter schedules or school pickup and with, with my kids and stuff. So to be able to just hop on Teams or sometimes Zoom, is huge. for me.
yeah, absolutely.
So, well, I want to thank our presenters, Jennifer and Dan, here today. Thank you very much. For those of you who are on Zoom, I see Paula put in a link for the feedback form that we'd like for you to fill out. And so we can make these better. Also be on the lookout. We are looking at scheduling some other events. Finally, if you are attending for extra credit, please put in the chat who the teacher is and your name so we can give you credit for that. I will contact your faculty member on that. So if there's anybody else, then that's it. I'm going to stop the recording and I want to thank our presenters again. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the invitation.